In the 1980s, a new age of sci-fi was developing thanks largely to the popularity of Star Wars. While certain franchises like Star Wars and Terminator have spawned multiple sequels and TV shows, there's another iconic 80s sci-fi film that not only spawned an entire new subgenre of sci-fi, but has gone on to become a cult classic, spawning only one sequel so far. Of course, I'm talking about Blade Runner. In this video, I'm going to be going over the history of Blade Runner, the legacy that it carries, and how this franchise that has made not a lot of money at the box office has such cultural significance in our society, and how Blade Runner changed the landscape of sci-fi forever. The 1982 film Blade Runner was loosely based on the 1968 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Director Ridley Scott was in charge of adapting this novel and bringing the vision of Philip's work to life, and it's very easy to say that Ridley Scott did a phenomenal job with adapting this world from page to screen. The story takes place in a futuristic but very rainy Los Angeles, and the visuals are nothing less than stunning. Pair this incredibly decaying future set in 2018 with the Vangelis soundtrack, and you create an atmosphere that's equal parts mesmerizing and horrifying. Blade Runner centers on a retired Blade Runner named Rick Deckard, whose job was to hunt down human-looking robots called replicants after they got out of control. Well, 4 replicants have since returned to Earth looking for their creator, and it's Deckard's job to hunt them down because he's the best in the business.
You're a good laser tag player. Maybe the best I've ever seen.
It's a very classic noir detective-like story, but blended with this universe, it feels incredibly refreshing, even for a film in the 80s. Deckard goes on hunting these replicants, however, he ends up falling in love with a replicant and makes him feel differently about hunting down these people. And yes, I say people because there's nothing sci-fi or unnatural looking about replicants other than a glimmer in their eyes. And that's done very purposefully throughout the film in order to convey the story's message and themes about what it really means to be a human being and finding purpose. These replicants were very unlike Arnold's Terminator and the droids of Star Wars. Replicants looked and felt like real people. Well, for a lot of reasons, Blade Runner didn't perform nearly as well as they were hoping it would at the box office. You have Harrison Ford, who is fresh off of Star Wars and Indiana Jones, playing another sci-fi action hero to get people in the theater, but Blade Runner isn't an action movie. It was very much unlike every other sci-fi film at the time, leading to a lot of critics dismissing the film and calling it a bust. It also didn't help that it was released between other huge 80s sci-fi films like Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. It was only years later that Blade Runner was recognized for the brilliance it contained. It was different from all other sci-fi films of the time, and for that reason, the reception only got better with each increasing year. This also influenced 7 different versions of the film to date. There was the theatrically released version of the United States, as well as the international release, which contained a bit more graphic action sequences, a director's cut that was released 10 years later in 1992, the final cut, which is probably the version that you've all seen unless you're a hardcore Blade Runner fan, and that came out in 2007. All other versions were either test cuts of the film or limited release showings in theaters. If you've never seen Blade Runner, you probably still recognize its influence from sci-fi projects of our time. Cyberpunk 2077 would have never been made if it weren't for Blade Runner quite literally jump-starting the cyberpunk genre, along with many other different pieces of art as well. If you want to check out for yourself the effect Blade Runner has had, go ahead and ask Siri if she dreams of electric sheep. But because of the cult classic status that Blade Runner eventually achieved, a few years ago the studio decided that maybe it was time for a sequel. With Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling on board, we got the sequel titled Blade Runner 2049. In 2015, 3 years before the original film actually takes place, it was announced that a sequel would be made, and all the hipster OG Blade Runner fans groaned. How could a sequel live up to the original standard? Is it going to retain the same atmosphere or just be a Blade Runner skin of a Marvel movie? These were all very valid questions because there aren't a whole lot of sci-fi films that aren't just big battles and explosions in today's day and age. But all the fans breathed a sigh of relief when they heard that Harrison Ford would be returning, Ridley Scott would serve as producer, and Denis Villeneuve and Roger Deakins would be the director-DP duo. All of the cards seemed to be in the right place, but would the movie be as good as it's made out to be? Leading up to 2049, we were given 3 short films that would serve as prequels to help bridge the gap between the first and second film. The first was an animated short called Blade Runner Blackout 2022, about how a powerful weapon causes a global blackout in the year 2022. Blade Runner 2036 Nexus Dawn was the second short, and this time it was live action starring Jared Leto as Neander Wallace, in which he gives his reasoning to the LAPD as to why they should be using newly constructed replicants for their service. And the last short film was called Blade Runner 2048 Nowhere to Run, which shows Dave Bautista protecting 2 very important people on his farm. These aren't essential viewing to understand what happens in 2049, but it certainly gives more context as to why it's now okay that replicants are in this world, and in the first Blade Runner they were all hunted down. But the actual film centers on Ryan Gosling's Officer K, who is a replicant himself, and he's on the case of trying to track down Rick Deckard for answers. Dave Bautista's character was actually protecting a mother and child, the child being a replicant themselves, the first ever case of replicants being able to reproduce. Of course, this is the child of Deckard and Rachel from the first film. Officer K believes it to be him, but he has to come to terms that it actually isn't. If I'm being honest, 2049 is definitely my favorite of the 2, maybe because I didn't have any nostalgia for the 80s version, or just because 2049 is more appealing to modern audiences, but to this day, 2049 is one of my absolute favorite films, and I rewatch it pretty frequently. The film does keep in tone with the cyberpunk noir detective story that the original presented, and although it does retread some of the same themes as the original did, I haven't met a Blade Runner fan who says that 2049 didn't at least live up to the original, if not actually exceeding it in many ways. So now that the original Blade Runner is a critical success, surely the follow-up would be too, right? Well, that's exactly right. 2049 scored some of the highest reviews of any film in 2017, and even in recent years. Did this film exceed the box office failure that was the first film? Well, yes it did, but that definitely didn't mean it was a success either. On a $150 million budget, 2049 only made $259 million worldwide, considering the film a box office failure. So now, after 2 very financially underwhelming films, it's surely time to let Blade Runner go, right? Well, that's not what Ridley Scott wants. He has plans for a 3rd film and even a TV show, but we'll get more into that one in a bit. If you want to take any positives out of this film other than its fantastic visuals, story, performances, music, etc., then take away Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford's relationship. It's Perhaps theatrical films just weren't the best route to take for the Blade Runner franchise, so we got Blade Runner Black Lotus, an Adult Swim animated series that explored a more traditional sci-fi action side of the Blade Runner universe. This series takes place in 2032, seeing the effects of the blackout in 2022. It centers around a young woman who wakes up with no memory and has to piece together clues about her past to see if she's a replicant or not. The show was met with very mixed reviews, some saying that it offers a new side of the Blade Runner universe, and others saying that it doesn't respect the themes and history of the 2 films. I've only seen 1 episode, and I can see both sides of the argument, but it didn't really hook me into the story like the movies did. There's also plenty of other comics and video games that all take place in the universe, either before, during, or after the events of both proper films. Many people theorize that the Alien franchise is part of the same universe as Blade Runner. There's not really a ton of evidence other than the use of AI and Ridley Scott being the director and producer of both franchises. If people are interested in seeing those connections, be sure to leave a comment below and I'll be sure to do a video on it. As I mentioned earlier, it's now confirmed that Amazon is making a live-action Blade Runner TV show, with Ridley Scott definitely producing and maybe even directing. The films didn't make much money, but perhaps a live-action TV show is the way to proceed with this universe. There's no details as to what it's going to be about other than the name Blade Runner 2099, so I think it's fair to say that Rick Deckard will not be in the show, and probably not Officer K either. The main question is, will the show follow in the footsteps of the first two films, or try something different like Black Lotus did? Either way, with Ridley Scott on board, I'm happy and excited to see what he comes up with. No matter how unsuccessful the Blade Runner franchise has been, it never seems to go away. If this TV show fails, I'm sure in another 10 years we'll get another film or TV show or comic series that will continue evolving this franchise. While it never did well financially, the Blade Runner fanbase goes stronger as the years go on, and maybe it's for the best that we only have 2 films. Oversaturation is a huge problem with modern day franchises, and if we just have 2 films, some shorts, an anime, and a TV show that succeeds, then I'm happy with what we have. What will the future of the Blade Runner series look like? I guess only time will tell. Will it grow into a huge blockbuster franchise, or will it remain a strange legacy? Thanks for watching the video. Let me know down in the comments below which Blade Runner film you prefer and your thoughts on the upcoming TV show. If you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.